Hello and welcome to episode 28 of the Machine Ethics podcast. This month we're talking with Cennydd Bowles on his book Future Ethics, Collective Action in Tech Industry, Why the Tech Industry Deserves Regulation, the Tech Industry Climate Change, and Design Crits and Design Sprints. If you'd like to find out more about the Machine Ethics podcast, go to machine-ethics.net, or if you'd like to support us, go to patreon.com/machineethics. You can also check out my other work at ethicalby.design. And also rate us, share, and find us on Spotify, iTunes, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you happen to be a first-time listener, then I recommend going back to episode 18 to get up to speed with some of the ideas and technology involved with machine learning and AI. Thank you, and hope you enjoy. Hi, Kenneth.
Hi.
Thanks for joining me on the podcast.
My pleasure. So my name's Cennydd Bowles. I'm a designer and I call myself a tech ethics consultant these days. I don't think I've quite earned the right to call myself an ethicist. Mm-hmm. Let's see. So my background is digital product design. I was a designer at a bunch of tech firms. I spent 3 years at Twitter heading up the UK design team there. And I've worked in governments, startups, .coms, e-commerce, etc. Over the course of the last couple of decades. So I'm very much a technologist and designer by trade. Coming into the last couple of years really with a real focus on the ethics of Silicon Valley and the ethics of emerging technology, because as you and your listeners will be all too well aware, there's plenty of work to be done on that. So I wanted to see where I could contribute.
Right, and you've just released your book on the subject, actually, haven't you?
I have, yeah. I've just released a book called Future Ethics,
which
has been a fairly long couple of years in the making. So that's been out a few months, and so far the reaction, the response has been very positive. So that's really nice to see.
Awesome. And I guess I feel like what I'll do is I'll come back to that, if that's okay, because the first question we always ask is, what is AI?
Oh, yes, right. Yes, you do ask that, don't you? So I think AI is a term that gets less useful the closer you get to industry, because the folks working on what we might consider AI would recognize that actually it's just too broad a term, that really what they're talking about is machine learning. And to be honest, mostly within that, what they're talking about is deep learning, which, as we know, is essentially a rebrand of the neural networks from the 80s or 70s or whenever they first came about, but with a lot more computation, a lot more data, and a lot more layers. So for folks in the industry, they'll like the specificity. They will say, well, AI, you need to be more precise there. Mm-hmm. But I still think AI is a useful term for stepping away from industry, for talking to the public about any kind of increased capabilities that technology can offer beyond those of humans. And it's a useful term because it carries with it some expectations, some assumptions, some preconceptions, some hopes and some fears that can actually be quite useful in the public discourse. They can also harm as well. But unlike some, I don't want to just discard that term, because at least that's a common term we have with the public at the moment. And I'm sure we'll get onto this, but I'm very keen to engage the public in the kind of conversations we need to have in the field. Yeah,
and your book is obviously not directly all about AI, but it's more general technology ethics and the kind of a lot of different issues that we have in technology, building stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean, my focus is predominantly emerging technology. So there are plenty of interesting ethical conversations to be had about, say, the ethics of Facebook's newsfeed. But it's also a bit of a fait accompli, right? The thing is out there, it's already having these social and political and ethical implications. And so there's not a whole lot designers can do to change that now, I mean, other than joining Facebook. I'm more interested in looking at the challenges of the decades to come with design and with technology, because we have a chance to try and address some of those deep issues now. The trust that we're going to require as technologists, as designers, is only going to increase. We're going to ask people to connect more and more of their lives to the products and the services that we build. And at the moment, I don't think we've earned that trust as an industry. I think the last few years have shown some of the missteps that we've taken. And so now is the time to be having those conversations. AI is, of course, part of it. AI is a very large part of it. But I think sometimes there's too much of a focus on the ethics of, superintelligence and things like that, and this very, very real and very interesting questions, but perhaps questions that are maybe a couple of decades out, that can foreclose upon some more pressing issues like algorithmic bias or persuasive technologies and their roles in society and politics and human free will, etc. So I wanted to explore all of those. So the book essentially is structured almost from near to far. So we start with some of the contemporary issues,
right,
then look at what might be happening in a few years, then we reach some of the deeper sort of social change and economic changes that may come with the AI discourse that we're all very familiar with.
Yes, and does it bridge into that far off kind of more philosophy stuff? Maybe singularity, as the people like to call it.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly discuss those sorts of things in the book. I am also keen to recognise that we should build upon the work of others. The tech industry has this infuriating habit of believing it's the first upon any new shore, right? But of course, people have been thinking about this question. Futurists and science fiction authors and writers and philosophers and artists have been thinking about these issues for a long time. So I won't claim to be throwing in entirely new concepts into that domain. My job there is to reference some of the discussions that are happening and to contextualise those for real working technologists today, so that it becomes a little bit more real than these mythical far future ideas, to kind of ground them and prepare us, if you like. But yeah, I think that all falls within the remit of the same question. It's all, where does technology go next over the next 1, 2, 3, 4 decades, in my lifetime, I suppose. And how do we try to rise to those challenges?
Do you, in that way, also call yourself a futurist? Because that seems to me there's lots of people who do the conference circuit and make predictions and talk about some of this stuff.
I don't currently. I may be a futurist. Again, I think I have more work to do to sort of establish myself in that field, or probably more accurately, to feel comfortable calling myself that. I think it's very easy. It's a very easy title to just grab and throw upon oneself, but I like to have the credentials. So I'm certainly getting more interested in the application of some of the techniques we're seeing in future studies, in futurism, as techniques for technologists to sort of understand the potential implications of the technologies that they build. And so I'm interested in trying to tie those threads together. But at the moment, we'll see. One thing at a time,
Right.
Yeah.
So how did you go from Twitter and these different design practices and agencies and clients and things like that? And was there something that triggered your interest in the kind of ethics of technology or the ethics of what you were doing at the time? Or was it kind of a gradual thing?
I sometimes get people ask me that question, I think assuming that there was some Damascene conversion, that there was a moment where I was just filled with revulsion for the inside of Silicon Valley and I felt I had to get outside it and critique it. And it's not really the case. I think I always had an interest in ethics, even as a youth, but no training in it. It was just it would be what I call sort of intuitive ethics or moral intuition at that point. You have a hunch for what you feel is wrong or right in the world, personally, and I've been lucky enough to give conference talks and so on for quite a while. And I remember being introduced at one event, going back perhaps about a decade now, and the woman who's introducing me said, one of the things I like about Cennydd's talks is he always has this ethical angle on things. And I was like, oh, I do? I hadn't really realised that was something that I was projecting. So that seed really just started growing within me. And one of the reasons I joined Twitter was because I thought it was among the more ethical companies in the way that it handled particularly user data and privacy and things like that, and those sort of concerns were important to the team. And so it's guided me, but after I left Twitter, I decided that was the right time to try and learn more about this topic and to contribute, because it felt like there were so many gaps in technologist daily practice that needed to be addressed. And I think over the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen glaringly that that's been the case.
Yeah.
So I don't know whether I was just lucky or whether I was prescient in anticipating that gap, but spending the time diving into this topic in a lot more detail turns out to have been quite a useful thing to do, I think.
Definitely not lucky.
Well, perhaps a bit of both. I mean,
Yeah.
there's luck and privilege in that I, was afforded that opportunity that I could just step back and say, what do I want to do next with my career? Where are the areas I can contribute the best? And I recognise not everyone has that luxury.
Yeah. I mean, you didn't go to the Bahamas. You wrote a book, right? So that's a...
I did a bit of the
fine.
Bahamas, but
Yeah.
a little bit of the travel as well.
Yeah.
I enjoy travel, but which is something actually that nags me ethically.
Right. Yeah.
So a little bit of both, but the book was always, in my mind. I thought, well, I'm not going to get a better opportunity than this, so let's commit.
Yeah. So who's the book for?
So the book's primarily for working technologists, and by that specifically, I'm probably talking most to designers and specifically product managers within tech firms. Because I actually think that product managers hold most of the ethical power within these companies. My hunch is, well, certainly I've written it with the intention that it's likely to be most relevant to senior practitioners, because they're often the ones who are grappling with these issues. I think it was Richard Cennydd who says that ethics appears at the level of mastery. And once you've got to a certain point where you've built up the capabilities, then you start to recognize the deeper underlying issues that you perhaps hadn't given proper attention to. But that said, there are some really exciting things happening I'm seeing with, I suppose I'd call them junior or graduates coming into industry and recognizing that ethics is going to be a really important part of their career trajectory. So they're also grappling with these issues as well. So perhaps it's useful to those folks as well. But perhaps it is that whole thing of you write a book from whose absence you've suffered. It's the book that I could have used maybe 5 years ago. As someone who's made mistakes, who's designed things, and now you look back and go, I really could have done a better job, or perhaps that shouldn't have even been built at all. So perhaps there are other folk in my position who've reached a certain level of comfort and respect within the industry, and to an extent kind of want to tear that down a little bit and start transferring that social capital into trying to make a positive impact and trying to change things for the better in the industry.
So I think almost, if there were junior designers, junior devs who are picking this book up anyway, and they're going to take a lot out of it, obviously, in hopefully how they make decisions, and then hopefully maybe take to task the people who are above them a little bit as well.
I mean, I think so, and I hope so. And there's a strong case that that's what the industry needs.
Yep.
I mean, we'll go straight into all the stuff we're seeing around collectivization and collective action within tech. And obviously the Google walkout was a phenomenally large ethical and political story within technology toward the tail end of last year. And that kind of thing is likely to increase. Silicon Valley workers are increasingly realizing the power that they hold. But that power is collective power. If you stick your head above the parapet as an individual in these companies, you need to have a bit of clout in order to get away with it. So a junior who's read, say, my book or something similar, will have to recognise that standing up for what's right is not always that easy. It comes at a personal cost sometimes, and so it's far more effective if you can find allies to do that. So the idea of trying to hold people to account above them is important and long overdue, frankly, within the field. But it needs to be done carefully. It needs to be done on the grounds of proper ethical reasoning, so that one can make a proper case. And so that's what I'm trying to equip people with the book, is to say, here are some ways to think about these problems, and here are ways to justify decisions or to evaluate ethical challenges. And then potentially here are ways to stand up for what you think is the correct answer, and that's individual action, it's collective action. And that's something hopefully anyone in an organisation can start to affect. So I have a quote here, which I find quite amusing. I haven't, as I said before, I haven't finished reading the book, so this is quite an early quote. Sure.
And it's quite amusing to me because it's something that is dear to my heart. All those pointless thought experiments and dusty Greeks. So do you think that a lot of these conversations you're having in the book and with people generally are things, like you say, that are morally coming from your experience and from the environment and culture, or do you subscribe to some of the dusty Greeks and utilitarians and all these sort of phrases and ways of constructing ethical frameworks and stuff like that. Do you go into that in your work?
I do. Yes, I mean that phrase about these thought experiments and dusty Greeks. I should stress is a.
It's like a pithy comment.
Yeah, something like that. It's essentially saying, well, this is what people believe ethics is.
Yeah.
And of course, ethics isn't about that. Ethics is a vital and real topic. It's about how do we choose to live our lives. For me, it's a pledge to take our lives seriously. And so that is vital and everyday and living and breathing. And coming back to my prior comment about the tech industry's annoying habit of trying to solve everything from first principles, I think that would be a mistake here. We should recognize that ethicists, philosophers of technology, futurists, etc., have been looking at these issues. Philosophers have been looking at them for millennia. How do we live the good life? I mean, this goes back through Aristotle and Plato and so on. And we would be fools not to listen to some of those ideas. Now, my job in the book is to try and translate those and contextualize them, as I say, to ground them in the real, in the technical challenges that we face every day, to convince people that maybe you don't have to read Kant, but you should at least understand his ideas because they are relevant to the sorts of challenges that we face. So the book isn't a theoretical book. It's not I don't have a philosophy background. I have a physics degree, and then I'm a designer. So two extremes that are quite dissociated in some ways. But to try and recognize some of the fine work that's come before, because when I committed to writing the book and really started to research it, I was blown away by the depth of the insight and the vitality of the discourse and the debate that was happening. And I wanted to be part of it, and I wanted to help translate it for people and open people's eyes to this living, breathing philosophy and ethical discussion that's happening. So we shouldn't close our minds off to what's gone before, because they're decades ahead of us, some of these folks, so let's learn from them. I think if I can help bridge the gap between what's happening in particularly philosophy of technology and tech practice, then that's my job done as an author.
One of the ways you're going to be doing that, as well as the book, is going in, doing consulting, doing ethical design sprints and things like that. Yeah.
So this is, obviously off the back of the book, I'm now thinking, well, what can I do to to further this cause, and of course to try and make a living for myself as well. And I've been working with a few companies since the book, and it's something I'm picking up further this year to say, okay, well, how do we try to translate this into positive change within organizations? Because right now, I think there's no questioning the appetite. After the book, I traveled pretty much the entire west coast of the US, talking with Facebook, Dropbox, Hulu, big tech companies, Microsoft, and so on that side of the world. And there's a real appetite to try and make some change here. I think tech employees, particularly designers, get this and really want to try and change things, but we don't really know where to start. I have some ideas, of course, on where to start. So if I can work with those folks to try and bring some of the ideas from what's happening in academia, what's happening in science fiction, and so on, and actually ground those in everyday design and product development practice, then I think that's where the change comes from. I think what we need to get to is a point where ethics becomes an ethos, which is Cameron Tonkinwise's way of looking at the problem, which I really like. What I don't want to do is just have an ethics checklist at the end, right? You've done your usual design process.
Yep.
Is it ethical? Tick some boxes. Great, ship it. That clearly won't work. So there needs to be some deeper change in how we develop products. And so, working with companies to help figure that out and to try and get something that becomes a repeatable process, becomes a change in mindset, if you like, of the people at that company. So it's early days for that. I mean, the book's only been out a few months, but I'm looking forward to committing more time and energy working with clients on that in the future.
Yeah, awesome. You and I both went to Juvet.
Yes.
On different years.
That's right. I was the year before you. Yes.
Yes. To the beautiful Norwegian countryside. What did you take away from that experience?
One of the main ideas that became concrete for me during that session was the idea of art as a provocation. it's all very well having slightly isolated conversations, potentially slightly elitist conversations about what do we think the future of technology should be. But we need to engage a wider group, public, members of the public, legislators, officials, educators, etc., in that discussion as well. But these folks, they've got other priorities in life. They're not always literate in exactly what's happening inside AI or machine learning systems today, or they're not ethicists or something like that. So we need to find a way to bridge these conversations in ways that folks can congregate around and say, okay, well, here's what I think. And it was in conversation with Dan Hahn and Kate Devlin, who's just written her new book, Robots X.
Yep.
And then Matt Webb as well. And so a few folks, and we just sort of got chatting at various points and helped me to realise the idea of having an artifact around which we can all gather and we can sort of throw into the world and say, well, it could be something like this. Is that what we want? And you could say perhaps things like science fiction and Black Mirror and so on are starting to stimulate that kind of conversation as well.
Yeah.
But that's one of the main things that I took away is we need to start creating, getting things out there into the public sphere so that people can start to have those conversations rather than having these abstract thought experiments as we talked about.
Yeah.
Concretizing it, making it real. My old boss at Twitter has Mike Davidson has a policy when people don't know where to go out for dinner. No one wants to go first. He'll always say McDonald's. Because no one wants to go to McDonald's, but at least when something's out there, you go, no, I'm not going to McDonald's. How about this? How about this? And so it starts the conversation going.
Right.
So the same idea, creating these artifacts, these be they art objects, be they what I would call a provocatype is a word I use for those. Other people might call them a design fiction, to stimulate that conversation. So you've really brought together some of that thinking in a way that actually quite excited me. So I'm very grateful for that opportunity and for that weekend.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, the Black Mirror and those sorts of artifacts are obviously very useful for those conversations because you could quite easily just go, well, we're building this thing, we don't want it to be like that, so... And it involves maybe VR, and you can reference some sort of mixed reality Black Mirror episode or something like that.
Sure.
So do you think almost we have to go overboard with creating these sorts of publicly available consumables that will help people make better decisions by introducing them to the subject?
Yeah, I think we have to start creating quite a lot of these things. I think one of the negativities I see, or one area that this field of speculative design, I suppose you'd call it, is not working very well, is at the moment those artifacts are just sitting in art galleries or in R&D labs somewhere. They're not with the people who they need to be with. And so we need to get them out of those ivory tower kind of places into the living, breathing world for people to interact with. So there's quite a lot more to be done around that. There is a danger when we create these things that we automatically fall into the patterns of dystopia or utopia.
Yeah.
We already have a bunch of utopian concept videos. I mean, you look at, Microsoft's vision of the office in 2025 and it's people writing on glass and it's all that. It tells us nothing about the future other than that Microsoft would like to be a part of it.
Yeah.
But then we look at Black Mirror and of course you could definitely say that there are too many dystopian angles in that as well. And, dystopias can be useful. They can be cautionary tales. They're fables. It's I'm not saying there's no value in that kind of thing, but I'm more interested in the artifacts that they're not morally neutral. I mean, no artifact can be morally neutral, but that contain moral multitudes that we could see falling into negative patterns of use and positive patterns of use. And then that discussion becomes, okay, how do we ensure it has more of the positive use cases than the negative?
Yeah.
So there's a careful line to be drawn there. I think we have to recognise there's value in dystopias and utopias, but God, they're so seductive and so easy to fall into. There's something in that grey area between that feels more productive.
Right. You could be trying to produce a utopia and get to a dystopia. Like
there's a very compelling argument that politically the dystopias that have been imposed upon various nations over the last century or 150 years or something like that have all stemmed from utopia. The belief that this is truly the way to a better world can lead to authoritarianism, can lead to saying, well, it has to be like this, we have control every aspect. And of course, then you have totalitarianism, you have all sorts of freedoms being taken away, you have all sorts of essentially genocidal perspectives that can come from what appears initially to have been a utopian concept.
Yeah.
So it's tricky and dangerous, I think, to not recognise that grey area in between. I think that's a bit of an antidote to that.
Yeah. So you have this wealth of design experience, and obviously you've worked within these companies that are some of the largest technology companies in the world. Do you have an idea that some of this work has to bleed into other areas, such as political structures or legislation and things like that, as well as maybe what we talked about so far is predominantly making decisions when you're creating products? Do you think there is a place for these other types of control, or these other types of overarching decisions that we need to make?
I do, yeah. Regulation is coming.
Right.
The ship has sailed on that. The tech industry will be regulated, most obviously in the EU. GDPR was, of course, just the first step in that direction. California is now trying to push through a privacy directive of its own. There will be plenty more regulation coming to the internet within the next few years. Some people are obviously speculating we may even end up with 3 sub-internets: a Chinese internet, a European internet, and a US internet, and the rest of the world. We'll see where they fit in. But that will mostly come, if that happens, that will be the result of different regulatory regimes. And, we deserve regulation, frankly. The lack of regulation, or the lack of success of our self-regulation is pretty damning, I think. And there is public appetite for it. There's even appetite for it in the tech industry as well. If you ask, I can't remember the source, but there was a study that asked people, should we regulate the internet more closely? 82% of the public said yes. 92% of tech industry employees said yes. So
wow.
I think there's a clear mandate there, and it's definitely going to happen. The industry and practitioners should be involved in that process, because wherever you sit on the political spectrum, no one wants bad regulation. Bad regulation makes everything worse. Good regulation, now you may find there's a left-right schism there, that the left may be more welcoming of regulation than the right. But as I say, bad regulation is the thing that we have to avoid. And with no disrespect intended to legislators, they're not always, as technically literate as technologists. I mean, why would they be? So I think we have almost a moral duty to try and be involved in that conversation, to try and help people make laws that genuinely improve human freedom, improve the human condition, reduce some of the stronger abuses of power that are happening within technology as a sphere. So I'm actually quite excited for that to happen. I think that's something interesting. Politically, beyond just regulation, there is absolutely scope for change as well. Now, I have to recognise that ethics and politics are intertwined, but they are also separate things. And I think it would be a mistake for anyone who's interested in ethics to try and just reduce it to a political perspective. Ethics is something we should all be interested in, whether you are a libertarian or a socialist or a liberal or whatever you are. Ethics should guide the way that we behave and the way that we try to structure our society. So there are absolutely political opportunities for change, but I'm wary of trying to sort of espouse a message that is easily dismissed as, it's just political ranting. I don't think that's a success state for ethics. If it starts to become something that one entire political wing, whichever that is, can disregard, then it's going to fail. So although I have obviously my own personal political opinions, it's not that I necessarily hide them, but they're not potentially all that relevant, I think, to the ethical discussion for me. Now, there are people who entwine those much more, and there are people who are asking deep questions about the structure of society, the structure of capitalism, and that's great. We need those questions asked, and I welcome that those people are having those conversations. And maybe, those are the right answers. Maybe we do need to make fundamental changes in our societies and so on. But I'm a fan of pulling every single lever we have in front of us at the moment. Things have got to a position where, sure, we need people to educate designers on how to avoid putting just dark patterns, misleading interface in, minor stuff.
Yeah.
And we need people saying, what's the future of society in a climate change society and an energy scarcity society in 50 years' time? Can we have capitalism, democracy, all these things? How do they exist? How do they function? How do we shape society? And we need people asking all of those questions, right from the micro, right up to the macro, and everything in between.
Yeah. And would you say you're more on the, here's how you design better products, here's how you make better decisions about, services and things that you're creating in the future? Or
I try to have a good knowledge of what's happening at all ends, at both ends of that system. I would, although I have opinions on, the far future things and the deep political stuff, I also recognise that those are things that people have been studying for decades. And I would rather defer to the people who've been doing that hard work for that time. Say, these are the people we need to be listening to, let's do that. Rather than, as I say, coming back to this idea of trying to solve everything ourselves. So we should be listening to political activists, we should be listening to theorists, economists, people like that. But we all have something to contribute. So I, obviously I have opinions about all of those things.
Yeah.
In terms of, how I affect change and how I try and work with companies, it's not going to be particularly easy for me to go into a tech company and say, okay, well, the first thing we need to do is disrupt capitalism.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I have to recognize there are more tangible things that companies are looking for. And, there are plenty of fantastic and motivated people trying to make those bigger changes as well. And best of luck to them. And I support them in those endeavors.
What if actually surreptitiously through the work with companies you're in fact affecting capitalism? Dun dun dun.
So be it. One of the laws, a principle in ethics that I talk about in the book is this idea of the law of double effect. The idea that you can sometimes have a secondary intention, but that the primary intention is honourable, and the secondary effect is sometimes one that you deem acceptable as a consequence of the first.
Yeah.
Bluntly, yes, I do think there are questions to be asked about the structure of capitalism and whether it forces us into ethical compromise.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to go out there and foment revolution. I'm not equipped to do that. If I help people question their role within those systems and understand how they can try and live the kind of life they want and that they think is beneficial to society, then again, that's really where I want to focus.
Yeah.
Again, this is part of this. I don't want ethics to be something, you screaming leftist, right? You're just saying this because you have an axe to grind. I do think there are questions to be asked, but as I say, it shouldn't be a polarizing thing to explore what are the implications of technology on society, technology on capitalism, etc.
Yeah.
These should expand beyond those wings.
I mean, that was definitely a pithy comment from me, so I apologise for that.
No, it's okay.
Do you think there's any, to press you, would there be any kind of quick wins or things that are so blaringly obvious that we could do? Or
Sure. Probably the easiest point of leverage is in the design critique process. So designers will, for those of you who aren't, listeners who aren't, don't have a design background, you'll have a design critique or crit process whereby designers share work in progress and you rip it to shreds and you say, well, did you consider this? Did you consider that? And so on. That's a great point of leverage for ethics conversations because, frankly, a lot of those questions are already ethical. Well, who's this for and what's it going to mean for them and what's going to happen next? So there are techniques we can introduce there to try and tease out some of the unintended consequences of these decisions. One I particularly like is something I came across in a book by Sarah Wachter-Becher and Eric Meyer called Design for Real Life, and this is a technique called the Designated Dissenter. And so you just appoint someone whose job it is to be a constructive antagonist, so they're basically just a bit of a pain in the arse in the design process. They wear the hat of dissent. Well, what if I don't want to provide this information, or what if I'm going through a messy divorce and you're asking me for sensitive, marital status details, and screw you, I'm not going to do that. And just to challenge the assumptions of the team, to start to broaden perspectives of how might people see what you're doing in a different light. How could it be abused? How could it be abusive? And challenging the team to come up with better decisions, to reach a little bit further into that, to really understand what's going on.
Yeah.
So critique, I think, is a really important part of it. And there are plenty of things we need to do as well, probably around definition of who we consider stakeholders. So maybe this is the second thing I'd throw in. We've had, I think, too narrow a definition of stakeholders in technology. We focused on user-centered design. This has been something that designers love. But it's not just about users, of course. There are societies and ecologies and communities and even concepts such as the freedom of the press, which have been affected by technology. We need to find ways to bring those into the discussion as well. All these externalities of technologies have fallen on these folks, and we've ignored them. We haven't been thinking of them systematically through our design work. So we need to reframe who we think of as stakeholders. So right at the start of projects, sure, you still ask the questions, who's going to use this? But also, who's not going to use it, but will still be affected by it? Who might be involved? Who do we need to reach out to and actually understand their perspectives better? So there's a job for researchers there to broaden the team's perspectives, but also designers and technologists, I think, have a duty to be a bit broader in their thinking. So that's right at the start of a process. You want to have that soul-searching, if you like.
Yeah, and I think I read some of that in your book, and I felt that that was instantly grappleable. Like, it's a concept. Oh yes, we should be thinking more broadly about what who are the people that are touched by this technology, even if it's not your core audience, your core stakeholders, the people that you're actually aiming it towards. What are the other externalities? I think you and how are they going to be affected?
Right. If you open an MBA textbook, there will be a section on stakeholder analysis. But a lot of those textbooks will define a stakeholder as someone who can affect the project, right? And there'll be people in suits or regulators or something like that. But of course, there's a second group of stakeholders, which is people who can be affected by the project. And those are the folks we've not looked at. If you look at Airbnb as an example I give in the book, great service, well designed for precisely two sets of people. People who have property they want to rent out and people who want to rent property. Terrible service for people who live next door to an Airbnb, because if you live next door to an Airbnb, you no longer have a neighbour. You have a different neighbour every couple of days. The costs of that system all fall upon the local neighbourhood. Rents go up. People won't conform to the norms of that neighbourhood. They're not invested in trying to make that neighbourhood better.
Yeah.
And so it's those folks who end up paying for it.
Yeah.
So it's really trying to refocus on that second group of stakeholders who can be affected by our work. And that's a fairly foundational shift, I think, that we need to address.
And you can really obviously relate it to things which are more obvious, because that's some sort of less obvious to try and work out who are these other people that you're touching. But if you talk about Uber or Airbnb kind of demolishing other people's companies, hotels or smaller B&Bs, and then obviously normal taxi ranks and black cabs and things like that are being directly affected.
Sure.
Or more easily, understandably affected in these ways.
But we have to be a little bit careful here as well, though, because there is a risk that looking and spending time talking and thinking about the ethics of technology can make you appear obstructionist, can make you seem like a Luddite wanting to hold back the tide of progress.
Yeah.
And until a few years ago, tech critics were often labelled as these kind of King Canute characters trying to hold back the inevitable change. And there's plenty to dislike about the hotel industry or the taxi industry and so on. These weren't necessarily great things for the world in their previous incarnations. I like the framing from Peter Paul Verbeek, who's a philosopher of technology in the Netherlands that many of your listeners I'm sure will know. And he says that ethics should accompany technological progress. It doesn't have to directly oppose it. And sometimes it will, of course, but sometimes it won't. It just goes alongside a lot of the time. And so we shouldn't be directly oppositional. We shouldn't say necessarily it's a bad thing that industries are disrupted. But the question is, what are the implications of those? Is it going to cause joblessness, social change, externalities to fall upon society's most vulnerable, which often they unfortunately do?
Yeah.
So it's about, as Verbeek says, it's about using ethics as a lens to examine the impacts of technologies rather than just to try and hold back progress for no reason.
Yeah. And do you think there's a place in displaying that lens somewhere? So if you are going through this process and you have discoveries of some sort of design process which includes some of this work, and you want to talk about it, or you're encouraging companies to make it transparent, or find a way that we can, talk about it in public together, discuss, we've made this decision, we think it's an ethical decision, etc. Do you think that's a way that we can collaborate? Because obviously working with organisations is one thing, but then obviously taking it outside into the public has often been difficult to do.
Yeah, I think there is a tightrope to be walked there. The idea of designing completely in the open is extraordinarily difficult. Some people who've worked in open source software, for instance, might recognise how hard that can be, and how polarised people's views can be. BBC employees, for instance, will be all too familiar with any change they make. There'll be a whole host of people saying, well, it wasn't broken, why have you fixed it? And so that gets difficult. There are ways, however, I think, to engage the public in a more controllable way for the technologist. I'm sceptical of the idea that we can design well without that.
Right.
There is a big risk that we start turning what should be democratic decisions into technocratic decisions that rest just with enlightened technologists who happen to know the coding languages or whatever it is. And that doesn't feel right for society and for human flourishing. But of course, that has to be a manageable process. I'm often inspired by the idea of co-design here, which has its roots in... I don't know exactly where it's rooted, but I sort of associate it with a lot of Scandinavian design practice, the idea of bringing representatives into the design studio and actually collaborating with them, handing them, modelling clay, or handing them, felt markers so they can actually join in that product discovery and design process. I think the old approaches we've had within design of creating something and then just running it through a couple of rounds of testing at the end to see whether it's usable, that's not going to address the foundational issues about ethics. That's not going to uncover those externalities or the potential harms that technologies can do. And frankly, a lot of the time they're positioned too late in the process for any kind of real change to happen. So there does need to be a more fundamental engagement, I think, with the public. And that might be beta communities, beta testers, people like that, but also taking the time to understand and to listen to, I think, people who are often harmed by technology. And because of the way that technology and society are interwoven, unfortunately, a lot of the harms of technology fall upon society's most vulnerable people. And so I think we have a duty to understand those people and to ally with them and to listen to them. Something the industry has spectacularly failed to do, to understand where these harms might be multiplied by the things that we're building, and to try to take mitigating action right at the start, rather than shipping something and then realizing, we've screwed up, right, hit the undo button and try again, which has been our approach far too often.
Yeah.
So there are, I think, manageable ways to do that by talking to these representatives. I mean, there are pressure groups, there are campaigners, there are industry figures or well-known figures within a lot of these communities. And it's absolutely right that we should be reaching out to those folks. And I hope that we do a lot more of that in the coming years.
Yeah. Awesome. We're getting towards the end. The question I always ask at the end is, what things are you scared about with this technology? We were talking usually about AI in the podcast, but kind of maybe the world of technology, production and things in the future, and what else excites you?
The thing that scares me is actually, I think, the thing that scares or should scare humanity the most, which is climate change. There is a far larger intersection between the tech industry and climate change than technologists claim or like to believe. We're living now in an increasingly hybridized world of physical and digital coming together. If you just ask Volkswagen, what happened with their emissions scandal, that was a software hack. There are, however many tons of CO2 now in the atmosphere because those emissions were cheated, thanks to a software engineer who decided to do that. And I have a huge amount of respect for the emotional resilience of people working in the field of climate change, because the news there is not good. Let's put it that way. The dystopias are real there for sure. And unless we take drastic action pretty damn soon, then we will be seeing essentially some kind of human die-off at some point in the next 10, maybe not 10, but 20 to 50 years, to 100 years. And that terrifies me. And I think as technologists, it behooves us to consider our roles within that and to try to take that drastic action, because sadly it's not being taken and anything like the scale that it should be. So that's my extraordinarily depressing fear. What excites me is the hope for more radical change to be facilitated by technology. Having said what I said about not wanting to get too sort of nakedly political because it could mar this idea of trying to make ethics a concern for everyone.
Yeah.
It's clear that we do need to make some big changes in society. And it's clear that our current trajectory is unsustainable for all sorts of reasons. But I'm excited by the prospect of technologies freeing people from the yoke of what David Graeber would call a bullshit job, freeing people from work that doesn't really advance society in any kind of way, and to free us to focus on these issues that truly matter, like how do we combat climate change? How do we structure society in that world of scarcity? How do we overcome the political and ethical challenges that will create? How do we transition safely between today's society and whatever society is more sustainable in future? Those are huge questions. And while we are, while a large portion of society is working on stuff that does not matter, we will be unable to address those questions properly.
Yeah.
So I'm excited by the prospect of controlled and well-distributed wealth from automation helping to free humanity up to tackle some of those bigger challenges. Got a huge amount of work to do before that happens. But if it does, I think that's the only way we're going to tackle those. So I choose to be optimistic about the way that could refocus humanity to ensure our flourishing and frankly even survival over the coming decades.
Yeah. Well, let's strive for that future.
Yes, indeed. Let's hope for it.
Let's do it. So thank you very much for your time. If people want to follow you, get in touch with you, buy your book, that sort of thing, how can they do that?
Sure. So I'm on Twitter, of course. My handle there is @Cennydd, which is @CENNYDD. And I'm extremely easy to find because my name is spelled so unusually. My book, Future Ethics, you can find out more of that about that at future-ethics.com.
Sweet. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.